who do you think will become the new Prime Minister of New Zealand?
Chris Hipkins, Prime Minister Chris Hipkins, has a certain ring to it. He's clearly the front runner. He's the safe option. I'll be very surprised if he's not the one that's anointed on Sunday or even before Sunday. I think very quickly we'll see some of the other supposed candidates drop out. And, he's someone that, has quite a bit of public recognition, a fairly good reputation. He's seen as down to earth, a good communicator, experienced. So yeah, I think he's the sort of person that Labour needs at the moment. Obviously, they could consider someone like Kerry Allen if they wanted to go with something a bit different and a bit more fresh, a generational change. And of course, Kerry Allen would tick a lot of boxes for Labour and some of the sort of target support for Labour. The fact that, she's a young woman. She would be New Zealand's first Maori Prime Minister. In fact, she'd be the first out gay Prime Minister. And so, these aren't insignificant things. And, symbolically, they'd be quite big and they would play out to a good narrative for Labour. But of course, I think she will be the deputy to Chris Hipkins, and they'll probably be a very good combo.
The Prime Minister leaves office with probably just enough popularity internationally to continue to have a successful career. I mean, her timing is strategic, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The writing was on the wall for Jacinda Ardern. Those polls have just been going all the way down over the last year and a half. And not just the government's popularity, but Jacinda Ardern's popularity. And so she chose to get out before she was pushed out. And that's why it's smart. Not many political leaders are able to kind of have that emotional intelligence. Obviously John Key was another one that saw where things were going, saw his stocks were, going down, so sold when he was on a high.
Yeah, and as you say, I mean, you live or die by those political polls, whether you like it or not. The writing, she knew the writing was on the wall.
Yeah, and it was going to be a hard year. And it wasn't just about being defeated, which was the likely outcome in the election, but, which has got a lot of gnarly issues to deal with, from the cost of living through to complaints about climate change on both sides, housing crisis, I think probably some difficult decisions to be made within her own caucus. I don't think it would have been a very pleasant year. She could see that coming.
Do you think co-governance, Three Waters, the hate speech legislations, the public didn't want those, according to online polls conducted by Stuff, in fact? That meant she had no choice to stay.
Yeah, look, for the first few years of the Ardern Labour government, I think Ardern was particularly adept at keeping her government focused on the things that mattered for most voters, and so they were around health, education, the economy, and. But there's always been an element of the Labour Party that is concerned with progressing a social justice agenda. People refer to it as a woke agenda. Ardern, I think, was quite aware of the way that might capture the government or disconnect the government from the wider public. And so being, a person from Morrinsville, I think she instinctively knew that a lot of those, sort of ethnic, gender issues weren't going to be the way forward for her government.
Then why did she allow it, though? Because arguably some commentators, left and right, have described some of these policies as being quite divisive. She didn't have to let these policies go through, though, did she?
Well, it really started changing around the time of that landslide victory in 2020, when they won 50% of the vote, and suddenly Labour was a majority, and that was just an incredible result, and it meant that they could do whatever. And at that stage, I think Ardern lost control of her own party, her own government, and you had all these people in Labour that said, yes, we can do whatever we want now. This is the time to start progressing a social agenda. And by social, yes, I mean around ethnicity, gender, some of those kind of, post-materialist concerns that kind of Labour voters aren't traditionally that interested in. And so I think that was the start of the end, really. And of course, you have the very powerful Maori caucus within Labour. And, there's not a lot of factions within the Labour Party, but that certainly is the big, powerful faction. And, the Maori vote is very important to Labour for good reason. And so, those MPs have a lot of leverage, basically. And so they insisted on Three Waters. They insisted on progressing co-governance. And I don't think Ardern herself was ever an enthusiast for any of those things. She had to sell them, not very well, but she had to try and sell them. I think, we're yet to see what's happened behind the scenes. But, there's obviously been battles, and there's obviously been pushback against Mahuta at times, and Mahuta's won, I think, on these things. And
Absolutely.
we saw this most starkly with the Three Waters legislation at the end of last year and the entrenchment debacle. And, that was of huge tension, I think, inside the Labour government.
The narrative being created by some I note on the extreme left is that she's leaving because of misogyny. Look, without a doubt, there were targets of, vicious online attacks and even death threats, as we know, even people before the courts as a result of those illegal threats. But I somehow feel this narrative now is going to be used by some on the left to demonise anybody who dared to criticise the Prime Minister, placing critics in a box. Now, that's more dangerous for society than ever before, isn't it? When you start placing somebody in a box who you disagree with, then you start casting them names because it's the easy thing to do.
Look, this is a really serious issue, and I think you would have noticed, Chris, and I have, that things are heating up. And New Zealand traditionally doesn't have a very toxic, polarised political culture, but that has changed in the last year and a half. And I think it has a lot to do with COVID. Surely it has something to do with social media and other kind of global inputs into our politics. But so things have heated up, and I think we do risk having political violence. But it's not just against the Prime Minister, it's against politicians of all stripes, it's against people in the media, anyone with a public profile, I think, is at risk of a lot more ugliness than in the past. And so, yes, maybe that did contribute to Ardern not enjoying her job so much. Politicians have to put up with much more than they did in the past. But I do think there's a real danger if that new dynamic becomes kind of a partisan electoral weapon to beat people over the head with. And so I think the left, as you call them, really do need to pause and take a really sober orientation to this issue and not just use it as a kind of opportunistic weapon to use against opponents, because I think that just builds into a culture war. It's counterproductive. It doesn't actually produce a conversation and a debate about how we have civil debate, discussions and talk about politics. Instead, it says you're the bad guy. These people are bad. These people are deplorables. And that's a dead end. I don't think that really helps our discussions at all.
I think probably what doesn't help when it comes to trust, and that is I can't help but think the Journalism Fund didn't help with credibility for some news organisations, but also it didn't help with the government when it comes to trying to maintain trust. And now we know there were conditions placed on media companies if they were successful in getting funds from the likes of New Zealand On Air. That was always going to be a problem for the government that I think they probably didn't see coming, did they?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we're seeing around the world at the moment, declining trust in all sorts of authorities, governments, but the media in particular. And I know, and quite rightly, there's a scrutiny or a suspicion of the links between journalists and politicians, between media outlets and those that have power. And I think that suspicion is often well-founded. Sometimes there are strong connections, and we should always be scrutinising when the state is giving funding or resources to the fourth estate. I mean, I don't think it's clear that the the Public Interest Journalist Fund has meant that the media has been bought by the government. But yeah, there have been conditions placed, and I think in the area of some of those sort of culture war things we just talked about, that's when I think that Journalist Fund has been trying to shape the conversations a bit. And when I look, I read a lot of media, and I consume a lot of this, and I do see some of this kind of state-sponsored journalism as being it does have a particular flavour. I'm not sure it's a pro-government flavour, but it has a kind of a sort of social justice flavour, and and certainly when it comes to issues of ethnicity, things about the treaty and treaty relations, I think it's quite problematic, this fund, that it has specifications about how things can be reported. So that has been a problem, but that's not to say that all the people that have been employed under these sort of schemes have been some sort of a proxy for the government or like that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Just a few final questions. I want to touch on Christopher Luxon. I mean, it's not a foregone conclusion, is it, for Christopher Luxon? No. I think what he suffers from is corporate speak garble, and the sense that he's trying to please everybody because he's still in that corporate mindset where I think he thinks he's being run by HR department personnel. He needs to show himself to be more authentic, because one thing that Chris Hipkins has over him is that Chris Hipkins does come across as perhaps being more personable, genuine, softer, likeable.
Oh, look, I agree with everything you've just said. Luxon, he's doing well. He's turned the National Party's popularity around. He's unified the party. He's played a role where he set up an alternative to the government, so that if anyone who might have supported Labour in 2020 has lost some faith, they're thinking about not voting Labour, Nationals now so inoffensive, and they've pulled back from the sort of Judith Collins or maybe even some of the negativities of Simon Bridges, and they're a safe place to sort of deposit your vote if you're a swing voter. But yeah, I find
is that intentional though? Is that part of their strategy, is to be seen as quite safe at the moment? I mean, they're going to have to change and become slightly more aggressive in their policies as we near the election, won't they?
I'm not sure. I suspect they'll carry on as much as possible to be beige, be bland, and it's worked so far for them. But I don't think it's good for democracy. I think elections are supposed to be about clear choices, contests of ideas. And at the moment, National's not really putting up any, inspiring alternatives, convincing. Well, on so many things, they're different from the Labour government, but, this much different. They're not actually completely polar opposites on anything. And so, it doesn't give us a lot of choice.
Yeah, it feels like they're playing it safe and just trying to ride it out until they become, the winners. That's the kind of the mindset I think they're in. Dr. Bryce Edwards, good to chat with you.
You too, Chris. Thanks.